Alright, in this video I'm going to provide a brief introduction to existentialism, particularly through the lens of Thomas Nagel's arguments regarding absurdity. Alright, so let's start with existentialism. Existentialism is a branch of philosophy, but also a style of literature, which explores some fundamental issues that we face in our human life. So these are questions like, what is the meaning of human life? And here we could be asking two separate questions. We can ask, on the one hand, what is the meaning of our individual life? And then additionally, what is the meaning of all of human life? So what is the general purpose or point of human existence? Can we have purpose in a purely physical universe? So this is a worry about maybe our physical death and our place in a merely physical world, juxtaposed with, say, maybe a previous conception of human beings, which maybe says that we have a soul, so our soul persists even when our physical body dies. What are the human implications for the scientific denial of God? So supposing that God exists, we've been able to build a specific conception of human life as being meaningful as the result of being maybe the plan of God. But if we deny God's existence, maybe we lose that sense of purpose. How do we explain the existence of evil? So there seems to be a persistent theme of evil in human life, and that maybe calls into question whether there can be purpose. How can our lives matter, given that they're so small, as compared to the grand scope of the universe? If there's a time in the future in which our actions won't matter, why do they matter now? So these two concerns are interrelated. They have to do with just the sheer scope of time and space as compared to the shortness of our individual lives and the smallness of our individual bodies. So how can this little life matter given how big everything is? How perhaps given how time is infinite and my life is very finite? How can we justify the monotony of existence? This is probably a feeling we all have sometimes in life. We go through our routine, we live our daily existence, and sometimes we can pause and call into question why we are pursuing this specific conception of life. That feeling might arise because it seems to be repetitive, and so lacking in some sense of newness or originality or spark, let's say. All right, so in his paper, The Absurd, Thomas Nagel is going to engage in existential questions. And he's specifically going to explore aspects of human existence which might cause it to feel absurd. So aspects of human existence which might make us feel like life is absurd or meaningless. So just as an initial definition, and we'll see that Nagel is going to give us a specific account of absurdity, but just as a first glance, so we can look at these concepts he has to offer, we can say that life is absurd if it lacks an ultimate point or is otherwise meaningless. So the goal of this paper is to look at aspects of human existence which suggest that maybe there's not an ultimate point, or maybe that life is meaningless. So Nagel does a couple things in his paper. First, he considers traditional conceptions of why life might feel absurd. He argues against those traditional conceptions, and then he offers his conception of absurdity. So the first part of this video will be an explanation of his evaluation of traditional conceptions, and then the second half of the video will be about his novel conception. So first he's going to explore ways people have typically articulated the reason human life feels absurd. So there's a couple of different interrelated concerns that Nagel considers, which might contribute to the sense that our life is absurd or meaningless. So I've listed them here. One is our inability to impact events deep into the future. Two, the size of our bodies as compared to the vastness of the universe. Three, the shortness of our lives compared to the great expanse of time. And then four, the severing of chains of justification at some point in the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at each of these concerns and then talk about how Nagel engages with each of these concerns, why he ultimately shows that they're not specifically relevant to the sense of absurdity that he wants to offer. All right, so first, our lack of impact on the future. So, life might feel absurd, says Nagel, because we may perceive that we have an inability to impact events deep into the future. Another way of articulating this concern is that what we do now in this specific life might not matter at some point in the distant future. So we go through our life caring deeply about what we do. We think our actions matter. And yet we can also perceive that at some point in the future they might not matter at all, because either we won't be remembered or because maybe the actions we do are not especially impactful in the scope of human culture. So I think there's two possible expressions here. One would be that the actions that I do right now won't matter to human beings at some point in the distant future. So this is the concern that I will be forgotten, and that the actions that I take to be greatly important won't ultimately be important in the grand scheme of human existence. But then we can also say, maybe it's that the entire arc of human civilization won't matter at some point in the future because the species will go extinct. So this is the concern that human life itself won't matter at some point in the distant future because at some point in the distant future there just won't be human beings any longer. So Nagel argues that this concern rests on a logical error, because if our actions won't matter in the distant future, it's not clear why what matters in the distant future should matter to us now. So, if people won't be concerned with us in the distant future, why should what people care about in the distant future matter to us now? Ultimately, the consideration seems irrelevant, says Nagel. Next he talks about the smallness of our bodies. So a person might think human life is absurd because ultimately we're such a small part of a very large universe. I have a very small body as compared to the planet, and this planet that I live on is very small as compared to the great expanse of the universe itself. Regarding the smallness of our bodies, Nagel is going to argue that having very large bodies, like if our bodies were inflated such that they were significantly larger, so that they were taking up a greater portion of the universe, this wouldn't really quell human concerns regarding the meaninglessness of life. In other words, large bodies won't entail more meaningful lives than small bodies. There seems to be no relation. And I think we can also imagine, hypothetically, a species significantly smaller than us, but which nevertheless, perhaps because of their intelligence, lives an actually very meaningful existence. So size itself doesn't seem to explain much about the absurdity or meaninglessness of life. The shortness of life. I think Nagel here is going to say the shortness of life will play a role, but he's going to introduce it through a specific conceptual lens. So you might think that life is absurd due to the relative shortness of life as compared to the vastness of time. So this is just the perhaps ugly concern that our lives are short as compared to the span of human existence and in the span of all of time that the universe contains. So this is, unfortunately, the concern that we will someday die, our life will come to an end, and it'll be quite short as compared to other measures of time. But I think Nagel really cleverly argues here that, look, if a very short life feels absurd, then it may very well be that an infinitely long life would be infinitely absurd. So the source of absurdity in a short life might just be amplified or multiplied over a longer period of time. So it might be that a long life would be even more absurd than a short one. And indeed, if we imagine living forever, we might feel like that's also absurd. If life never came to an end, that might also give us a sense of monotony or redundancy, which could give rise to absurdity. So Nagel doesn't think the shortness of life directly contributes to the sense of absurdity. Nevertheless, he's going to introduce it into his conception of absurdity in a specific way. So we'll kind of bracket this idea about the shortness of life. All right, next, he considers the idea that chains of justification are incomplete. This is a sort of more technical consideration. So in this concern, what matters to us now is explainable by other things that will matter in the future. So what we're doing now, we conceive of as important because of things that will happen after what happens now. So perhaps you care about your performance in class now because you care about graduating at some point in the future. So graduating in the future explains you caring about your performance now. And perhaps you care about graduating in the future because at some point you intend to engage in a certain professional activity. So your wanting to engage in a professional activity might explain your caring about graduating. And your caring about your professional activity might be couched in even future considerations about maybe having a family or having a different kind of financial reality or engaging in specific kinds of activities you find meaningful professionally. But presumably, this chain of justification, this explaining why we care about what we care about now in terms of what we care about in the future, will come to an end as a result of death. So, as Nagel puts it, we are on a road to nowhere. The chain of justification is incomplete. At some point, it will be severed. It will end. But Nagel thinks that this can't itself be the source of a feeling that life is absurd because chains of justification come to an end all of the time. When I'm done making this video, I will make myself dinner, and I will spend time thinking about how to season the food that I cook, and my valuing the meal being well seasoned seems important, but I don't need to explain it in terms of future events. So there's nothing about what will happen to me 4 years from now which is required for explaining why having a well-seasoned meal is important to me tonight. So once I've had the meal, the chain of my caring about the well-seasoned meal will end, will sever. And our lives are filled with chains of justifications coming to an end, says Nagel. So if we can perceive our life as meaningful despite these chains of justification regularly coming to an end, then the entire chain of justification of our entire life coming to an end shouldn't itself be a source of absurdity, says Nagel. All right. Now let's turn to his conception. And I threw in here some important quotes from his paper, which I think illustrate his conception of absurdity. So I'm going to just reflect on these quotes, read these quotes, and then I will develop my account of what I think Nagel is arguing here. So the first quote says, "The sense that life as a whole is absurd arises when we perceive, perhaps dimly, an inflated pretension or aspiration which is inseparable from the continuation of human life and which makes its absurdity inescapable, short of escape from life itself." So this inflated pretension or aspiration is relevant. We can perceive that we care quite deeply about the lives that we're living. And that's because we have our specific inner subjective experience, right? We all have our particular experience of the universe, which is separate and different from everyone else's. I think this is just a really important philosophical point to take home more generally. We're all having our inner subjective experiences, and they may be very different than the inner subjective experiences of others. But because we can only have our own inner subjective experience, we inevitably inflate the importance of that inner subjective experience. And it might be that one sense of absurdity is our recognizing that we do this kind of inflation, that we aggrandize our own particular inner subjective experience. We imbue with a kind of importance our inner subjective experience, which is actually not justified. And one source of justification will be simply that other people are not having our inner subjective experience, and so aren't valuing our lives the way that we inevitably value our own individual lives. All right, so I think that's part of it. Next, he says, if there is some philosophical sense of absurdity, however, it must arise from the perception of something universal, some respect in which pretension and reality clash for us all. So he's not trying to find some idiosyncratic aspect of a particular person's life which might cause that particular life to be absurd. He wants to give a more general conception, a more universal conception of absurdity, which applies to all of our lives. So that's what he means by something universal. It's something we all share in common. He says this condition is supplied, I shall argue, by the collision between the seriousness with which we take our lives and the perpetual possibility of regarding everything about which we are serious as arbitrary or open to doubt. Okay, so here he's really getting into his account. So the collision between the seriousness with which we take our lives. So we inevitably take our lives very seriously, right? We care deeply about what happens to us. We care deeply about those around us. We have specific goals and ambitions which we cherish, and we celebrate when we achieve, and we feel disappointment when we fail. So we have this seriousness with which we take our lives. And on the other hand, we always are able to evaluate our taking serious, our particular lives, and we're able to perceive that maybe our caring about this particular life is kind of arbitrary or open to doubt. So we can, at the same time, take our lives very seriously and also raise questions about the seriousness with which we take our lives. So it's the seriousness together with the possibility of questioning the seriousness, which can give rise to this sense of absurdity. All right, so here's another quote. And here are some examples of Nagel's idea of there being a discrepancy between pretension and aspiration. So in ordinary life, a situation is absurd when it includes a conspicuous discrepancy between pretension or aspiration and reality. And here are some examples. Someone gives a complicated speech in support of a motion that has already passed. A notorious criminal is made president of a major philanthropic foundation. You declare your love over the telephone to a recorded announcement. As you're being knighted, your pants fall down. So these are examples where someone cares really deeply about something that's happening, and their caring very deeply about it is not justified. So you're finally working up the guts to tell someone you love them, and you call them on the telephone to tell them you love them, and you feel that nervousness about it, and you finally say it, and you're taking it very seriously, but your seriousness is not justified because, after all, the voice you're hearing is actually their voicemail recording. Nagel thinks that life itself can be just like this. So we take our whole lives seriously, and at the same time, that seriousness is not justified. And additionally, we're able to perceive that that seriousness is not justified. But when we perceive that the seriousness is not justified, we go on taking it seriously anyway because we have no other choice. All right, so those are some quotes from Nagel that I think roughly illustrate the position. Now I just want to try to explain it in my own language. All right, so on Nagel's account, life can feel absurd partly as a result of the kinds of beings we are. We're the kinds of beings who can reflect on the nature of our own existence, which is unique. At least it may be unique. So we have a conception of the rest of the animal kingdom as not as capable of reflecting on their own existence. You know, like my dog is not questioning whether he's living the right kind of life. He's not wondering whether he's pursuing the right career, for example. He's just existing. But we do more than that. We exist, but we also reflect on our existence. So because we can reflect on our own existence, we can call into question the deep care and concern we invest in our lives. Right? So it's not just that we care, it's not just that we're concerned, but it's additionally that we can look at our caring, we can look at our concern and ask, is this justified? And you've probably had this experience where you're deeply passionate about something, or you're really upset about something that happened to you. And nevertheless, while you are feeling that passion and you are feeling upset, you might be able to step back and say, should I be feeling this way? Is it ridiculous that I am? It's this capacity to view our own lives from outside which is going to give rise to absurdity, says Nagel. So this ability to reflect allows us to step back from our actual existence and look at it objectively. So look at it as a fact about the world. We can perceive how we are and say, should we be this way? Does it make sense for us to care about these things? In asking those questions, we're asking more objective questions about our subjective experience. So when we look at our lives objectively, when we do this kind of rational self-reflection, we're able, at least to some extent, to step outside our inner subjective experience. So our inner subjective experience is the way it is to be us. This feeling about caring about what we are, what we're going to do, what matters. That's our inner subjective experience. It's the feeling of what it's like to be us. And although we're always stuck with that, we're also able to set it aside and ask more objective questions about it. We can say, does it make sense for me to care about this? So that is looking at your life more objectively when you ask a question like that. So when we step outside our inner subjective experience, we're able to look at what we care about and ask whether these cares or concerns are actually justified. We're setting aside our inner subjective experience and asking more objective questions about the experience itself. And here I'm just going to give some examples of how this might go. So for example, in stepping back, we might perceive that our self-conception is deeply intertwined with economic, cultural, and aesthetic commitments that we didn't rationally endorse, but rather were thrust upon us. So, here I'm imagining the person who has this idea that they'll be happy when they're wealthy and beautiful and own a big house with a fancy car. And they may be passionately pursuing these ends. And then they step back and say, wait a second, these concerns of mine, this self-conception that I'm trying to develop is dependent on economic, cultural, and aesthetic commitments that I did not make up, that I did not endorse, but are rather part of some larger culture that I'm trying to fit into. Right? So that would be the person stepping outside of their inner subjective experience and asking more objective questions about whether these particular concerns that they have, this particular self-conception that they've been developing, is ultimately rationally justified. Or we might perceive that our most sincere passions are ultimately quite superfluous when juxtaposed with the lives of human beings in the past. So, I don't know, you might say, I'm really concerned with the number of likes that I have on TikTok. And then you might say, wait a second, here I am being concerned about the number of likes I have on TikTok when a couple hundred years ago, people were concerned about whether they had enough grain for the winter. Because if they didn't have enough grain for the winter, their family would be hungry. So here you might just juxtapose like current contemporary human concerns and say, well, these are kind of superfluous as compared to previous human concerns. That's not to say that all of the concerns in contemporary culture are superfluous, and certainly people still deal with things like hunger. So, but it's possible in modern society to call into question our particular version of interests, cares, and concerns. Or we might become aware, doubling back to the idea of the shortness of our lives as compared to the vastness of time. We might become aware that despite our deep yearnings to live a purposeful life, it's not going to be possible given the great expanse of time and space. In other words, what we do now maybe won't matter in 1,000 years. And we might think that purposeful life can only be so if it matters in 1,000 years. So we might be able to juxtapose our particular current inner subjective experience, which is filled with our wants, desires, needs, and juxtapose it with the fact that all of that will someday be gone because our life is actually short. So we step outside our inner subjective experience and just perceive our lives as coming to an end someday. And so when we make that perception, we're looking at our whole life more objectively. All right, so those are just some examples of viewing our inner wants and needs, or what I'm calling our inner subjective experience, from the objective perspective. And when we get that objective perspective, we're able to call it into question. We're able to ask, is it really justified that we care about all this? Okay, which brings us to Nagel's sense of absurdity. There are two conditions for Nagel's sense of absurdity. For Nagel, the sense of absurdity arises when, firstly, we have these objective perceptions of our inner subjective experience. So because we're able to reflect, we're able to step outside our inner subjective experience and have an objective evaluation of our inner subjective experience. And that's going to cast doubts upon them. As when the person says, man, I've been caring about having a really fancy car for 10 years, and I've been pursuing a career so that I can have a fancy car. And then, well, I now I'm looking at that from the outside, and I'm seeing that maybe that's not justified. So firstly, we have the objective perceptions about our inner subjective experience, right? We have this ability to step back and reflect. And when we step back and reflect, we might cast doubts upon our wants, needs, and concerns. But then two, and this is also a necessary condition, we nevertheless continue on with our inner subjective experience. And here I think is the crucial aspect of this account. When we step back and we take an objective look at our inner subjective experience, and we cast doubts upon our inner subjective experience, we can't escape our inner subjective experience just as a result of casting these doubts. So we end up stuck with our inner subjective experience. In other words, what Nagel's pointing out here is, although we are able to reflect and try to have an objective look at our wants, needs, cares, our concerns, when we do so, this doesn't cause us to set them aside. And so the absurdity is the juxtaposition between our objective perception about our inner subjective experience and the continuation of our inner subjective experience. We can't step outside of it. We're stuck with it. But once we've raised the question, once we've cast the doubt, the shadow of that casting always looms over us. And it's that looming sense that maybe all of this isn't wholly rationally justified, which produces in us a sense, which might be perpetual, that life is kind of absurd. So for Nagel, absurdity arises when we juxtapose our deep passion and concern for our own life and our existence with the possibility that these passions and concerns don't stand up to rational scrutiny. And it's the juxtaposition because we live with both. We live with our deep passions and concerns, and at the same time, we're able to step back and constantly reflect on them and cast doubts upon them. But then we go on living our life. And so we're always stuck with this sense, perhaps just nagging, that the whole thing is a bit absurd.